So, thank you and welcome to our book group on the Seeds of Contemplation. This week we're looking at chapters 29 through to 32, and we're really heading into the text now. We're nearly at an end. I can't believe it. Only 2 weeks to go. That's incredible. So we're looking at these two chapters, and I have to say that when I was going through the chapters and just trying to sort of summarize what they were about for this introduction, I just couldn't but keep taking out quotations because there are so many amazing little sentences that he uses that I thought, oh yeah, that's just what it feels like. And maybe that's what's very characteristic about the chapters we look at tonight, is that what he's talking about, which is about our experiences of prayer, it feels to me like they're much more accessible chapters than some of his theological, philosophical. Yeah, I know what you're talking about, Thomas. And so in a sense, they were really a joy to read and weren't quite as hard work as some of the other ones have been. So at the core of these chapters, he's talking about our experiences of prayer. And he sees prayer not as something that, that is a kind of thing that we do, or that there is something that has a success criteria to it. Either you're good at praying or you're bad at praying. He sees it as something that is fundamental to prepare the soul for contemplation. He speaks about this sort of status prayer as a kind of loving attentiveness. That's what he describes prayer. It's a loving attentiveness of the soul for God. So it's not just about times of stillness or about purposeful times of prayer. It's something that can be contained or continued at every single moment of the day. So for him, prayer is loving attentiveness, and it primarily sits within the will. So when he talks about silent prayer or or mental prayer or anything like that, that is about sort of us preparing ourselves, really living with ourselves to be able to be free for our wills to be wholly engaged and caught up with love of God. So it's kind of a jumping off point. I think that's very helpful, actually. So the language Merton uses is for us, as I say, very familiar. And in a way, that's why, well, certainly for me, and I hope the same was for you, that these chapters kind of resonate with our own experiences, and then some of the other ones have. So I want to look at just three areas, and really it's only an overview of what the chapters are about and what you have an opportunity to talk about. So first of all, it's mental prayer. And then secondly, what about distractions? And finally, called the wilderness and trackless wastes. Wilderness and trackless. Wonderful line that comes from the Psalms. Whenever we come round to that psalm, and I can't remember which one it is, I just go, oh, this is so amazing. What an amazing image. Anyway, so to look first of all at mental prayer, So for Merton, mental prayer, and here's one of the quotes, develops and perfects our mind and will and our whole soul, which brings us in contact with God. So he's not so much interested with the different techniques of prayer that can be used, but to encourage us, in a sense, to leave our books behind and not so much to follow instructions to book follow, but to follow how God directs us and directs our will, and actually to do it. Now, if you'll notice behind here, I've got shelves and shelves and shelves of books. And I remember just sort of looking at them going, you know, Emma, that's really great. You've got all these books about prayer and Julian and the mystics. Why don't you just shut up for a bit and actually have some time to pray? And when I say to pray is just to, just to be before God and desire to be before God. And so that's really what Merton is saying, is that yes, you can get as many books of instructions as you want, and they'll give you lots of different techniques, but at some point you need to put them aside and actually do it. And also be liberated to find out what works for you. I do some spiritual direction, and it's often the case, and those of you who do spiritual direction will find people who are very loyal to one way of praying, and you just say, have we tried doing something else? And it's like a complete, it's like, a complete kind of, oh, really? And it's a great moment. And then there's a sort of liberation into, well, just see how the spirit moves you. So that's really what Merton is telling us to do. And I guess he wants to give us some confidence. Here is this monk, in a Cistercian abbey. He could give us a whole catalogue of things we should do, but he doesn't. But saying that, he does give us one or two hints on ways that if you're a beginner, and this is all a bit strange to you, what you can do. And they're really modern things, actually. And I was surprised when I read them, because I thought, oh, well, yeah, of course, they're in our toolkit now. But I guess when he was writing, they probably weren't in people's toolkits. So one of the things he says is, why don't you try writing or drawing? That can be a form of meditation. And as I have said before, and I have to get her name in somewhere in the evening, we have begun to realise that Julian of Norwich, when she writes, she's writing to understand, but she's also writing as a contemplative act in itself. So writing. And then this wonderful idea that he has about praying in the streets, praying when waiting for the bus. And I don't think he's talking about those kind of moments when, you're in a rush and you're in the car and you go, oh God, please give me a parking space. I don't think he's talking about those moments. I think he's talking about the sort of attentiveness of the will onto a loving attentiveness to Christ, to God. I think that's what he's talking about, not so much about wanting God to do something for us, but as we would when we would sit by a loved one when they're asleep or something like that. Then the third thing he says, which I think is really helpful, which is about going to church and the church's liturgy, and talks about, don't just be present, oh, I'm going to church today, but actually we have this fantastic sort of unfolding of Christ's life through the liturgy. And so often we're invited not just to hear, but to be involved, to encounter Christ through the liturgy. And it kind of really was brought home to me when we came to the end of this great liturgical season that we've just been through, right from All Saints all the way around, to to Trinity Sunday and Corpus Christi, how actually that is about half the year, and we are walking in the footsteps, walking through the life of Christ. And that's what he's saying, make that life of Christ your own, And in a sense, there are some seasons when we can really do that. So in the dark days of winter, particularly us in the Northern Hemisphere, and we have this whole light of the Christ child, it really speaks to us right here. And similarly, spring and Easter, there's that joyous Easter tide, joyful Easter tide, but you cannot but be joyful when all the birds are singing and, life is bursting. And it speaks to us here and here, but also right here. So I think that's really helpful, actually. So most of us but most of all, he says, is to understand that their mental prayer is not an end in itself, but it brings us to this kind of threshold and develops our ability to be able to recollect ourselves, center ourselves, and be aware of the presence of God within us. It's a bit like the anchorites, of course, of old had their cell, but it's a bit like saying, go to your cell, go to your cell in those moments. All the world is going on around you, and you have to be aware of that, but that constantly having that sort of place of recollected awareness of God's love, and to respond in a sense of, desire and love in return is what he's saying is at the core of why we actually do all the mental prayer and stuff. So that's all very well. And we know that, anyone who's been on retreat will know that, okay, I can sit in a nice room, I can go to the church and, I've got all this silence, but then suddenly your head just fills with stuff. And so Merton again talks about distractions in a very realistic and a helpful way. And you know that this is someone who has lived with distractions and, had to work through it and really grappled intellectually with what it's all about and not just the feeling of it. So for Merton, distractions are, they're not just normal. I found this quite illuminating. They're not just normal, but actually they are necessary as they increase and awaken a hunger and a longing for God within us. So it's when prayer feels utterly impossible, this is when we begin to learn to absolutely cry out to God, to kind of go, oh, I can't, you know what, I just, help, I'm lost. It's too much, it's all too much. And we recognize first of all, our helplessness, but also our incapacity. And entirely our will goes, all I know is that I want to be with you, God, but I can't do anything. And that, for Merton, saying, now you're beginning to pray. And I think that's wonderful because he's sort of saying it's when you can't, it's when it's the times when we think of our moments of failure that he's saying, no, now actually you're getting somewhere because it's no longer about you. It's actually about God. So for Thomas Merton, he says, basically give up on distractions. They just can't be managed by prayers or techniques or books or anything. They just have to be suffered, because if you're going to pray, that's what's going to happen. And what I find interesting is that his description of why distractions so haunt us is absolutely spot on as how it feels. So when our will is focused on just mutely and obscurely loving God, then what happens is the mind and the memory and the imagination, they don't have anything to do. There's no job for them. And so because there's no job for them, they don't like it. And instead, our subconscious just literally smashes apart because the mind wants to think and the memory wants to go back to what we did and the imagination wants to make us think about the next thing tomorrow. So when we're just saying, no, I'm not interested, I'm not thinking about you, they clamor more for our attention. And so he says this lovely thing. So the doors of the subconscious mind fall apart. And he says, and all sorts of curious figures begin to come waltzing about the sea. What a lovely image, of that. And there they are, wonderful image and absolutely true of how it feels. So what's Merton's solution? Well, Merton's solution in a sense is quite a simple one. Just ignore them. They're background noise. Just don't give them your attention. It's not, they're not important. Or even he says to have a sense of humor about them. It's like, oh yeah, you're going to think about that now. But I think what's also quite difficult, I think, for us folk who live in the world. I mean, he's in a silent monastery, so his distractions of what's going on outside are going to be, he can manage that a little bit better. But I think those of us who are in the outside world, we do have things that are very important that are going to we're going to worry about and that we are going to easily be distracted by. And who hasn't in their head had a horrible email from someone and then just sat in there, in the time of prayer and composed in their heads umpteen numbers of replies. And of course, for us priests, this might be the only time to actually think about what you're going to say on Sunday. So you start composing your sermon in your mind. And he's absolutely aware of that and he understands that, which I think is really helpful that he does understand. I says, just don't let that, distract you or be a hook to take your way. The other thing that he says is try and reduce the pressure in your life, which I think is nice. But actually he's got a point. He's absolutely got a point. But what's most important, the most important thing is the will to pray. And that's what's important. Not that your mind is not, not full of distractions, but that your will to pray is there. And finally, this beautiful section on the wilderness and the trackless wastes. And Merton's very helpful and realistic that for most of us, the contemplative path is not going to be about a sudden rush of light and an illumination, but that actually, I mean, that may have happened in your life and it may happen again, but that for most of us and at most of the time, the way to contemplation lies through, and he says, a desert without trees, without beauty, and without water. Very powerful language that he uses. And I guess it's the opposite of how we can often measure success, if you can ever speak of success in the prayer life. So in this, Merton, as we've noted before, is very much following mystics before him. And here we hear very much the tradition of John of the Cross. And here's another quote from it. I just kept pulling out quotes. And he says, when God begins to infuse his light of knowledge and understanding to the soul, drawn to contemplation, the experience is invariably one of defeat. That kind of tautology, isn't it? The lightsome darkness as well to Hilton talks about. So his description of the dark night is completely spot on, I think, as well. And hence, I think it's deeply reassuring. You know, he knows what the prayer life is like. He knows what can beset us. He knows some of the temptations in it, but he continually says, you know, stay quiet in the muteness and naked truth, resting in simple and open-eyed awareness, which brings with it a sense of peace. So next week, we're going to look further into this as Merton is going to go into it further and look at how we journey through this wilderness and give us some understanding, further understanding from his own experience. So I'm going to put people into breakout rooms, but I just want to say before we go into breakout rooms, it's really an opportunity for everyone in the group to speak. So please, can those of you who have lots to say ensure that everyone in the room has had an opportunity to say something. Now, it may be that one or two people really don't want to say anything, but as long as we make sure that everyone has had a chance to speak, then that would be really wonderful. I finished a little bit earlier this week because I'm aware that sometimes I don't give you much time to talk, and so it's harder for everyone to have a chance to say what they want. So hopefully you've got a good 35 minutes so you can share with each other different ideas and draw from one another. You know, what do you think about this text and how has it spoken to you? And what are the phrases that are really buzzing for you and the questions you want to ask, which the rest of the group may be able to ponder with you?